The fluorescent lights of the suburban Pittsburgh grocery store hummed with a relentless, artificial cheerfulness, a sound that felt like an insult to Arthur. At 75, he moved through the aisles not with the careful deliberation of age, but with the aimless shuffle of a ghost. The vibrant colors of fresh produce, the cheerful chatter of families, the smell of the bakery, it was all just noise, a world he was in but no longer a part of. His worn flannel shirt and faded jeans hung loosely on a frame, stooped by more than just years. It was bent by the crushing weight of a silence that had filled his small bungalow since Eleanor was gone. His eyes, once a bright blue, were now a dull, cloudy grey, gazing past the shelves of cereal and canned soup, fixed on memories no one else could see. He was an island of profound stillness in an ocean of bustling, ordinary life. Rolling toward him, a splash of impossible color in his monochrome world, was a little girl in a shopping cart. She couldn't have been more than 5, a tiny being perched like a queen on her metallic throne. Her dress was a riot of yellow and pink flowers, a stark contrast to Arthur's muted existence. Her hair was a tangle of brown curls, and her enormous, honey-colored eyes took in everything with a startling intensity, a genuine curiosity that the world had not yet managed to dull. Pushed by a young woman who was likely her mother, the girl, Lily, seemed to be charting the universe from her mobile vantage point. She wasn't fussy or loud, she was an observer, her gaze sweeping over the towering shelves and the faces of strangers until, with an unnerving precision, it landed and locked onto the quiet, sorrowful figure of the old man standing by the pasta sauces. Arthur had stopped completely, his hand hovering over a jar of marinara sauce that Eleanor had always liked. The scent of basil and garlic from a nearby display triggered a memory so vivid it stole the air from his lungs. He was back in their kitchen, her laughter echoing off the walls. It was in this trance that the shopping cart glided to a halt beside him. The little girl stared, her head tilted, her brow furrowed not with judgment, but with sincere confusion. For a long, silent moment, she just looked at him, seeing past the wrinkles and the stooped shoulders, right into the hollow space where his heart used to be. Then, her voice, as clear and pure as a small bell, cut through the store's hum. "Mister," she asked, with no hint of shyness, "why is your heart crying?" Her mother gasped, her face flushing with embarrassment as she started to apologize and pull the cart away. Before her mother could move, Lily stood up in the cart, her small hands gripping the metal bar for balance. She held out her little arms, a gesture of such unconditional offering that it froze Arthur in place. "Can I have a hug?" she asked, her voice soft but certain. "I think you need one." The question shattered the last of his defenses. It wasn't a question of want, but of need, and this child had seen it with perfect clarity. He slowly, creakily, leaned down, and her small arms wrapped around his neck. The embrace was clumsy, but the warmth of her small body against his chest was a jolt of pure life. A tear, hot and surprising, escaped his eye, then another. It's moments like these, so raw and real, that remind us what it means to be human. By subscribing, you help us continue to share these profound stories of connection. The warmth of the small hug lingered long after the shopping cart had disappeared down the aisle, a phantom heat against Arthur's chest. Sarah, Lily's mother, had hesitated for only a moment before scribbling her phone number on the back of a grocery receipt, her own eyes misty. She pressed it into his hand, a fragile slip of paper that felt heavier than a block of steel. For Arthur, accepting it was an act of profound courage. It was the first time in months he had made a choice that wasn't dictated by the hollow echo of his past. Driving home, the familiar streets of his quiet Pittsburgh suburb seemed somehow different. The afternoon sun, which usually felt cold and distant, now cast long, warm shadows that danced on the pavement. He was choosing to let a sliver of light back into the sealed tomb of his life, and the thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. His bungalow was just as he had left it, a museum of a life that was over. The photos of Eleanor smiled at him from every surface, her presence so potent it was almost a physical weight. For a moment, a crushing wave of guilt washed over him. He felt like a traitor, as if the simple promise of a phone call was a betrayal of their 50 years together. He sat in his worn armchair, the receipt clutched in his hand, and stared at the silent telephone on the end table. It had been an instrument of bad news for so long, a harbinger of condolences and sympathy he never wanted. Now, it represented a fork in the road. He could let the silence reclaim him, or he could dial the number and step into an uncertain future. The memory of Lily's clear, innocent voice asking about his crying heart made the decision for him. Their first meeting was at the local community park a few days later. Arthur almost turned back 3 times on the short walk over, his heart pounding with an anxiety he hadn't felt in years. He felt foolish. An old man pinning his hopes on a conversation with a 5-year-old. What could they possibly talk about? But then he saw her, a flash of yellow and pink on the swings, her small legs kicking with joyful abandon. Sarah waved from a nearby bench, a warm, reassuring smile on her face. As he approached, Lily's face lit up with pure, unadulterated recognition. She scrambled off the swing and ran toward him, not with the caution of a child meeting a stranger, but with the familiarity of a long-lost friend. She simply took his hand, her tiny fingers wrapping around his, and led him toward the sandbox, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. A quiet routine began to form. Twice a week, they met at the park. Arthur found himself opening up in ways he never thought possible. He didn't speak of his grief directly, but he told Lily stories. He told her about a brave steel worker who helped build the city's great bridges, and about a woman with a magical garden who could make any flower bloom. He was telling her about himself and Eleanor, translating his life into fairy tales she could understand. Lily, in turn, shared her world with him, stories about preschool, the names of her stuffed animals, and her very serious opinions on the best flavors of ice cream. She didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. She offered her presence, a gift so simple and so powerful that it began to slowly, painstakingly patch the holes in his soul. He started to see his memories not as painful ghosts, but as gentle stories worth sharing. The changes in Arthur were subtle at first, then undeniable. He began to wake up, not with a sense of dread, but with a quiet anticipation for his park days. He started tending to the small, weed-choked patch of dirt in his backyard, the garden that had been Eleanor's pride and joy. He planted a few marigolds, their bright orange faces a defiant splash of color against the grayness of his house. He found himself humming old tunes as he worked the soil, melodies he thought he had forgotten. His stoop seemed a little less pronounced, the dullness in his eyes replaced by a flicker of the old spark. He was no longer just an automaton going through the motions of living. He was a man rediscovering the rhythm of life. One small, tentative step at a time, guided by the hand of a little girl. But the world has a way of looking upon unusual friendships with suspicion. The quiet whispers started in the neighborhood. Mrs. Gable from across the street, who once offered a sympathetic nod, now watched from behind her curtains, her gaze sharp and questioning. Other neighbors at the park would pull their children a little closer when Arthur sat on the bench with Lily, their conversations dropping to a hushed murmur. The sight of an elderly man spending so much time with a young child who wasn't his granddaughter began to curdle the air of the small community. The innocent bond they shared was being reframed by outsiders, twisted into something strange and unsettling. Arthur felt their judgment like a physical chill, a reminder that the outside world was not as pure as the one he shared with Lily. It's a cruel reality that a connection born of pure empathy can be so easily misread by a world quick to judge. The simple, healing joy he had found was now being viewed through a lens of suspicion, and that felt like a second, deeper injustice. Sharing these stories is so important because it reminds us to look for the heart behind the circumstances. By subscribing, you help us continue to shine a light on these moments of truth, ensuring that kindness isn't silenced by fear. The whispers eventually reached Lily's father, Mark. He was a practical man, a loving father whose first instinct was to protect his daughter from a world he knew could be dangerous. While Sarah defended the friendship, recounting the story of their meeting in the grocery store with heartfelt conviction, Mark's brow was furrowed with worry. He saw an unknown variable, a risk he wasn't sure he was willing to take. He questioned Sarah gently but persistently. "We don't know anything about him. What if he's not who he seems?" His skepticism wasn't malicious. It was the heavy armor of parental fear, and it began to form a barrier between Arthur and the little girl who had become his lifeline. A wall built of love, but a wall nonetheless. Arthur felt the shift immediately. He saw the hesitation in Sarah's eyes when she agreed to their next park meeting, heard the strained tone in her voice. The external pressure was beginning to seep into their small, safe world. The joy he had started to feel was now tangled with a crippling sense of fear and shame. He started to believe the whispers himself. Was he being selfish? Was he putting this kind family in a difficult position, tainting them with his own loneliness? The guilt he felt over Eleanor's memory returned with a vengeance, now amplified by the fear that he was bringing trouble to the only people who had shown him kindness. He began to see himself through the neighbors' eyes, not a grieving man finding a reason to live, but a strange old recluse. This was the fragile turning point, the moment where his healing heart was threatened not by his own sorrow, but by the misunderstanding of others. It's a profound struggle to hold onto a glimmer of hope when the world seems determined to extinguish it. If you believe in the power of these human stories to overcome doubt and fear, your subscription allows us to keep sharing them with a world that desperately needs to hear them. The fear became a paralyzing force. Arthur started to retreat, building his walls back up brick by brick. He called Sarah one afternoon and made a clumsy excuse about not feeling well, cancelling their park meeting. The disappointment in her voice was a knife in his gut. The following day, he let the phone ring, watching it vibrate on the table as her name flashed on the screen, his hand hovering over it, unable to answer. The silence he had once found so crushing now seemed like a necessary shield. He was caught in an impossible bind. The loneliness was a slow, steady ache, but the thought of causing pain or trouble to Lily and her family was an acute, unbearable agony. He chose what he believed was the lesser of two evils, retreating into the familiar grey of his solitude. For Lily, the world suddenly stopped making sense. Her friend, Grandpa Arthur, had simply vanished. She asked for him constantly, her small face clouded with a confusion that was slowly turning into a deep sadness. She couldn't comprehend the adult complexities of suspicion or fear. She only knew that the person who listened to her stories and made her laugh was gone. Sarah found herself in an agonizing position, caught between her husband's protective stance and her daughter's palpable sorrow. She saw the light dimming in Lily's eyes, the same light that had so miraculously reignited Arthur's. She knew that this was more than a casual friendship. It was a fragile, essential ecosystem of healing, and it was on the verge of collapsing under the weight of a world that was too afraid to understand it. The finality of Mark's decision was a blow more brutal than Arthur could have imagined. After a neighbor had made a particularly venomous comment about his unhealthy interest in the child, the meetings were forbidden. The phone call from a deeply apologetic Sarah had been short, but the silence that followed was infinite. Arthur retreated into his bungalow, the small victories he had won against his grief turning to dust. The marigolds in the garden now seemed to mock him with their cheerful color. He felt the weight of the community's judgment settle over him like a shroud, confirming his deepest fear that any attempt to reach for life would only result in more pain. The house, which had started to feel like a home again, reverted to being a tomb, and he was its sole, desolate inhabitant, haunted not only by the ghost of his wife, but by the vibrant memory of a little girl's laughter. Lily, in her own 5-year-old world, was experiencing a grief just as profound. Her bright spirit seemed to dim overnight. She stopped chattering about her day, pushed her food around her plate without interest, and her laughter, once a constant melody in the house, was gone. She developed a low-grade fever that the doctor couldn't explain, a physical manifestation of her heartache. She didn't understand suspicion or adult fear. She only understood that her friend, the one who told her stories about brave bridge builders and magical gardeners, had disappeared. Sarah watched her daughter's light fade with a growing sense of dread and guilt. She had tried to protect her from a phantom danger, but in doing so, she had allowed a very real and tangible sadness to poison her little girl's world. And she knew she could not let it stand. With a resolve that eclipsed her husband's cautious fear, Sarah knew what she had to do. One grey afternoon, she lifted a listless Lily into her car seat and drove the few blocks to Arthur's Street. The bungalow looked smaller and sadder than she remembered, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at a world it no longer wanted to be a part of. Every fibre of her being screamed that this was the right thing to do, that some connections are too pure to be broken by the cynical whispers of others. She walked up the cracked concrete path, holding Lily's small, cool hand in her own. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she raised her fist and knocked on the old wooden door, a sound that seemed to echo with the full weight of her hope and her daughter's silent sorrow. The door opened a few inches, revealing a sliver of Arthur's face. He looked a decade older, his eyes hollowed out by a fresh wave of despair. He saw them and began to close the door, not out of malice, but from a broken instinct to protect them from himself. But Lily was faster. She slipped from her mother's grasp and pushed her way inside. She stood before him, her tiny body trembling, her big honey-colored eyes swimming with tears. "Grandpa Arthur, I miss you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Daddy doesn't understand. You were just fixing your heart." The simple, profound truth of her words shattered the last of his defenses. He sank to his knees, his own tears finally breaking free, a torrent of grief and fear and love. "I was so scared," he choked out, his voice raw. "You made me feel alive again, and I was so scared of losing that." In that moment of raw confession, as he held the sobbing little girl, Arthur felt a profound shift inside him. He realized his fear was not a betrayal of Eleanor, but a testament to the love they had shared. She would have wanted this for him. She would have wanted his heart to beat again. He hugged Lily tightly, a promise and an anchor in one gesture, and looked up at Sarah, his eyes clear for the first time in days. "She's not just mending my heart," he said, his voice steady with newfound conviction. "She's teaching it how to beat again." From the doorway, a new figure emerged. Mark had followed them, his face a canvas of conflict and regret. He had heard everything. The simple purity of the scene before him washed away his fear, leaving only shame and a dawning understanding. He stepped forward, his own voice thick with emotion, and simply said, "I'm so sorry, Arthur. I was wrong." The apology hung in the air, not as an end, but as a beginning. The wall of fear had crumbled, replaced by a bridge of understanding. From that day forward, the invisible lines of family were redrawn. Arthur was no longer just a neighbor or a friend. He was Grandpa Arthur, a title he accepted with a quiet, profound gratitude that settled deep in his bones. He was woven into the fabric of their lives. Sunday dinners became a new tradition, his small bungalow filled with the clatter of silverware and Lily's bright chatter, chasing away the ghosts of silence. He would be on the porch to greet her after preschool, his pockets often holding a smooth stone or a uniquely shaped leaf he'd found for her. The house, once a silent monument to a life that had ended, slowly began to breathe again, its rooms filled not just with memories, but with the promise of new ones. The transformation extended beyond the walls of his home and into the earth itself. With Lily as his small, eager apprentice, Arthur began to resurrect the garden that had been Eleanor's pride. His hands, once idle with grief, now worked the soil with a renewed sense of purpose, planting rows of marigolds and tomatoes. He taught Lily how the sun and water coaxed life from a tiny seed, and in doing so, he felt his own dormant spirit stirring. He was no longer just receiving kindness. He was nurturing life, sharing the simple wisdom he and Eleanor had cultivated over decades. The neighbors, including Mrs. Gable, saw the change. They witnessed the shared laughter over a stubborn weed or the triumph of the first ripe tomato. Their suspicion melted away, replaced by a quiet, communal respect for the beautiful, unconventional family that had blossomed in their midst. Arthur's newfound purpose soon rippled outward, touching the wider community. He realized that his profound loneliness wasn't a unique affliction. The town was full of quiet houses and silent seniors just like him. With Sarah's enthusiastic help, he approached the local community center with an idea. He started a program called Grandparent Storytellers, a simple weekly gathering where elderly residents could connect with children from the local daycare. He would sit in a circle of wide-eyed kids, telling them the familiar tales of a brave steelworker and a woman with a magical garden, his voice steady and warm. He wasn't just recounting his past, he was transforming his personal history into a shared legacy, creating new bonds and proving that every life, no matter how quiet, holds stories worth telling and a heart capable of connecting. Years later, Arthur would sit in his old armchair, the worn fabric a familiar comfort, and watch as a 10-year-old Lily carefully taped a new drawing to the already crowded refrigerator door. The house was a living album of their shared time. He would often glance at the photo of Eleanor on the mantelpiece, her smile seeming to approve of the joyful noise that now filled their home. He had learned the most profound lesson of his life, that a heart doesn't have a finite capacity for love. It doesn't replace what was lost. It simply expands, making room for more. Grief had not been an ending, but a painful, beautiful metamorphosis in how love continued to live through him. It is a fundamental truth that a single act of empathy can change everything, and sharing these accounts is a testament to that power. Your subscription helps ensure that these vital stories of human connection continue to find a voice.